This is
Make It Plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of our regular contributors and partners on this broadcast, Make It Plain, for years has been Media Matters for America. We're joined now by the president, as always, Angelo Carusone. Angelo, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, as always. So the lead story at Media Matters right now, on cable news, the architects of the war in Afghanistan are now framing coverage of the withdrawal. It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? That these people are offering this punditry and critiques, and they're some of the people who got us in this mess in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. When we did the analysis, it was really narrow sliver too. It's not even like we went to the whole range of right-wing war hawks that had been advocating for war in Afghanistan and always, running interference for decades. Like, we even excluded them from the conversation. We just said, let's look at the people that are really the nexus of responsibility. Who are the architects? Who've been reported as the architects? We're looking at other news reporting. We basically looked at 6 guys who found out that they're on TV in a span of a few days over 51 times across all 3 cable networks. There's no one. I mean, obviously there's varying degrees between how terrible each of them were when it came to this. But the reality is the problem was across the board. All 3 cable networks uncritically brought on these architects to let them frame the withdrawal. And obviously, what their perspective was, right? More war, more time. And it is a good, there's been a lot of that sentiment and the critique about the coverage, but I think the idea here was, let's look right at the center and see how the people that have always been considered the architects were treated. And they got to shape the narrative.
10 days, 51 appearances.
Yep.
Jack Keane, 16 on Fox, 16 appearances. Barry McCaffrey, 13, all on MSNBC. David Petraeus, 6, 3 on CNN, 2 on Fox, 1 on MSNBC. H.R. McMaster, 3 on Fox, 2 on CNN, and 2 on MSNBC for a total of 7 appearances. And Douglas Lute, 5 appearances between MSNBC and CNN. And yeah, we have seen Leon Panetta too on CNN and on MSNBC. And as you point out, some of you might be wondering, well, who else would you have? Well, there have been almost no guests with, as you quote Sarah Lazar in these times. There are plenty of other voices that could be weighing in on the U.S. withdrawal, the countless people around the world, including in Afghanistan, who have been marching and protesting the war for 20 years. No voices, no nothing. It's pretty shameful.
That's right. I mean, and that's, Barbara Lee got 1 interview, I mean, it's like,
right.
It's like, they brought her on very early on, and it's not like there was not a real interest to have an actual debate or a framing. And in part because the cable news got committed to a narrative about what this meant for people's safety, what this meant for America's position in the world, right? I mean, they got committed to a narrative that withdrawal was bad. And that even further disincentivized them to bring on guests that would provide a clash, which is, if you think about it, a very rare thing on cable news, right? I mean, cable, what this business is like. When you're getting booked, they always try to figure out to bring somebody on that's going to have a different perspective. It's all about building clash, right? Having that kind of opportunity for the guests to, even if they're going at it responsibly and politely, but to have a disagreement, to actually come to some clash. There was no effort to have clash across cable news. The thing that I find really interesting about these guests is that it wasn't just that they were doing the segments and then that was the end of the discussion. Then you'd have the reaction segment immediately after their appearances, right, where you'd bring on pundits or former Bush administration officials to comment on the thing that Petraeus or McMaster or McCaffrey just said. So you were building not just segments, but entire blocks of programming around their appearance, and further, not having on, as you point out, some of these other guests that could have offered a different perspective. So even when there was a very clear segment dedicated to it, they still weren't providing that range. And I think, it obviously has an effect. It builds a narrative, and that's what takes hold.
But also, too, we know how ratings hungry these networks are. It seems that they believe having these big names or official titles it draws more viewers. That's probably part of their thinking too, isn't it?
Part of it, I'm sure that is. There is a competition to get some of these guests on because they have a name or an affiliation. But I mean, look, I've often said, like, look, they can make they made Donald Trump's empty podiums empty in 2016 interesting, right? So I mean, they would have that on the screen all the time, and they could make a melting ice cap interesting if they really wanted to, right? So some of it is how they frame the segments and the packaging around it as well. And bringing on board someone to have a radically interesting and different opinion, would probably get a lot of attention. And I think, I think what they end up doing is that some of these services have streaming platforms and sort of digital only programs, and they have better discussions on there that if you look online tend to be more well received across because they're having a wider discussion. So I think some of it I can understand. You want to have a name. I appreciate that. But overall, I think the coverage has been really bad. And it shows us and I look, we see this in a lot of other big areas too, but this in particular they got committed to a narrative and they brought these people on that were and they were uncritical. I mean, they treated them as the vaunted experts here, and there was just not a lot of criticism. So if you're going to bring them on, at least give the context.
You're right. They can make anything interesting. We learned that from Ron Burgundy, Anchorman, didn't he? When they just showed the car chase, and that ended up defining modern media coverage. You're right. They could do just that. More MIP after this message. What I also think is feeble too, Angelo, and I'm sure you remember this, during the Bush administration, they deliberately stopped showing the bodies coming home to Dover, Delaware. That was deliberate to keep, because when you see that, when that happened during the Johnson administration, that had an impact. All the flag draped coffins, that takes a toll. Bush administration never showed those images. Biden goes to Delaware and they show, the Biden administration obviously has no problem showing all of that. But to me, it's feeble of the media not to consider that even the lack of coverage of lost service members in Afghanistan for so many years has had an effect on people's sentiment toward the war. So that's the irony. That's the paradox. You see the tragedy now, the deaths now, and it's as if that is so far more unbearable than what was going on for 20 years. And the two don't stack up at all.
No, and they'll take the Wounded Warrior Project's millions of dollars in advertising revenue, right? I mean, they run those Wounded Warrior Project commercials all the time for years. They are a major advertiser on cable news. And that is, they'll take that Wounded Warrior Project money to advertise to people to give more donations so that they can help with prosthetics and rehoming and transition services and support services for veterans coming back from Afghanistan that have been injured, but they won't do segments on it. Right? As to your point, they won't cover that. So, it's not that they don't know, they do, but it doesn't fit a narrative. And I think, to me, the big lesson in all of this, aside from the politics, is that it's a live fire example of how a narrative can get latched onto and how powerful that can be when it is being echoed across the entire media ecosystem. It really drowns out a lot of opportunity for a wider discussion, for a recalibration of what that opinion is. The consensus was this was a giant mess up and a mistake, and that we're all going to be unsafe, and it's going to be. And I think that that's not a fair consensus, especially when you look at the way that the news media had covered this. They didn't cover the Bush. I mean, they didn't cover Trump's deal with the Taliban. They didn't cover all the stuff that was happening in Afghanistan all these months. They certainly didn't cover, to any real great extent, the death toll and the human toll. And that matters. I mean, that's affecting the decision here. So I think it's a good example. We have some big existential fights ahead. And this moment right here, I think was a good reminder that you cannot count on the news media when it comes to protecting people's right to vote or other basic rights. They're not going to be a champion coming in at the very end to, be an arbiter of what is appropriate and what is right. They're not going to do that. And I think, like I said, we have big crises. We're still dealing with COVID. We have climate change. We have an existential threat to our democracy and voting. And to me, the thing is not because I disagreed with the coverage, but if I just look at the methodology, the way they approach the coverage, this does not bode well for the three big fights that we have in front of us.
And so, again, it begs the question, are they still under the influence of Trump or under the influence of, as you and I have talked about ad nauseum, this need to avoid any hint of a liberal bias in media to the point where they go to the other extreme and don't police themselves. I mean, why was there not more coverage given, as you said, to what Trump did and didn't do when it came to Afghanistan, his foibles, and yet Biden is actually carrying out the policy that Trump put in place, which was withdrawal. And you would think that he is responsible. It's like all of the bedlam that has come about has totally fallen on his shoulders. What is that about? What is this ongoing need to treat the Biden administration so much differently from the Trump administration?
I do think there's a little bit of an opportunity for them to inoculate themselves against the criticism that they're in the tank for Biden. You know, the journalists, and especially at the editorial level, they're always looking for those opportunities to point to examples where you say, but look what I did. I remember when I criticized Biden for messing up Afghanistan. I'm not biased, right? They're so sensitive to the critique that they do work ways to inoculate themselves. And I'm mindful of that because, you know, when nonprofits do the same thing, they have to be careful of protecting their tax status. And so they do things so they can point to in case it's ever challenged. Like there's a calculus involved. News media is not nonprofits, right? They're just doing it purely for perception and fear of the right-wing echo chamber. They want that, there is a little bit of a reflexive piece. So this was an opportunity for them to say very clearly. I do think that we can't forget that ultimately, especially the big commercial media networks, love the war. They drag us into it, not just Iraq, right? But I mean, when you go back and look, the segments 20 years ago in the lead up to Afghanistan, the lead up to Iraq in particular, were filled with military contractors or people associated with military contractors, right? They weren't disclosing it, but they were just bringing on everyone that was grifting off of war to advocate for why we needed more war, and never once pointing out that they had a massive financial interest in the advantage of doing it. I mean, the majority of coverage was filled with war contractors in the lead up to the war in Iraq, right? And so I do think there's a part of it that they're in this one area, they've not proven to be trustworthy when it comes to coverage. I do think that there is a knee-jerk reflexive desire and lust for war. And I don't know where it comes from, but I will say it's definitely decades of crowding out any of the people that advocate for peace.
More MIP after this message.
Hey there, I'm Nadia Komodo. Check out my show Tigress, which is basically my unfiltered and unapologetic journey of being a work in progress.
Like, I hope that I am authentic and I try to be as unfiltered as I possibly can. I am so passionate about what I do, from talking about periods to wanting to build community around the cause to loving the business that I'm working on.
Tune in each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are streamed.
What we all know when it comes to local television and local media, everybody knows is if it bleeds, it leads.
That's right.
That's why the local news always leads with unfortunately murder and crime. I guess for the national cable networks, the bigger the bleed, the bigger the lead.
Right.
And so let's face it, that is what obviously people are going to gravitate toward and people are going to want to cover. Media Matters also points out, Fox, of course, has not changed. And they've actually had, even though you weren't here last week, I aired some of your clips last week from Media Matters. There were literally people, including one of their hosts, what I think is Dana Perino. They were all a part of the Bush administration critiquing what's going on. Like they weren't there. Like they literally were not present. And there were a couple other guys I don't remember all these crazy people's names. But these were people who were literally in the Bush administration, who were the literal architects of the war, criticizing Joe Biden. And then one of the latest headlines is how Fox even edited a video to make it look like Joe Biden was looking at his watch during the fallen soldier ceremony in Dover. But we know that's payback from when H.W. Bush literally looked at his watch in 1992 in a debate with Bill Clinton about 10 times, kept doing this, and probably cost him that debate, if not the election. But, so you've pointed out all the cable networks are guilty, but none more, obviously, as usual, egregious than Fox.
No, because I think the other cable networks are irresponsible. They have a perspective on foreign policy that they adhere to for a variety of reasons. Let's not forget that MSNBC, until not that long ago, was owned by General Electric, a massive war contractor. It's like, in addition to other things, they build weapons and war. Yeah. So, but Fox, the one thing that you can't say about the other channels that you can say about Fox is the other channels aren't malevolent in their coverage. And their reporters are actually got skin in the game. They're doing work on the ground. NBC has people had people inside Afghanistan. So did CNN. Real reporters, work, hard journalism. Fox doesn't have that. Fox has a Jerusalem bureau, and that's it. And they never had a reporter. They don't have reporters here. They have a few. They don't really do that work. Fox's coverage was malevolent. When there was that response strike Sunday morning, that drone strike, before it was confirmed there was a drone strike, the Fox's host, Pete Hegseth, they just found out that reportedly a child had died at this moment. That was what was there. And he said, I hope it was us. But he said, I hope it was us. I hope Joe Biden had the nerve to drop a bomb and it wasn't some terrorist. Wait a minute. You just said that it was a report that a kid died. You have no other information. And your first response is, I hope it was us. I mean, so I look at all the coverage on Fox, and one thing that I think is really different is it's malevolent. And just like last night, Tucker says now all these Afghans are rapists. That Joe Biden just brought tens of thousands of Afghan rapists into America. And they criticized him 2 weeks ago for not bringing in enough Afghans, for leaving people behind. And now they're going to attack them. And it's malevolent. It's a different kind of coverage. And I definitely think that it's appropriate and important to draw a distinction between the two, because they are really, really different. One you can critique because that's a dialogue and that may improve their coverage. And one is just evil.
Yeah. And we also know that, as you alluded to, some of their coverage, too, is about fear-mongering and xenophobia. Media Matters, we talked about this last week, too. I reported on some of your headlines, whereas even with Laura, that part of it is fear-mongering about immigrants. And she's even alleging that the Joe Biden agenda is to thwart America's immigration laws, circumvent America's immigration laws with what's going on in Afghanistan. So it's like, it's a triangulation. Don't end the war, stay over there, save the Afghanis, but don't bring them here. I mean, it's just a lot of different flying contradictory messages. And no wonder Fox's viewership is so confused.
Confused and mad. And Fox doesn't care if they're confused too, which is the thing in some ways, as long as they're mad, right? As long as they're mad and they know Joe Biden is terrible, that's good enough for Fox. Because in this case, they're not advocating to go back into Afghanistan. They're not. They want to drop bombs indiscriminately. Right. They think that's important, part of flexing. But they're not actually advocating for a foreign policy perspective, right? I mean, even if you criticize or critique or have a different perspective than, which I do, and a lot of the advocates of, like the neocons and others, there was at least a foreign policy that you can, like, you say, okay, that's their agenda. They're trying to spread this, right? Like, you understood there's at least a rationale behind it. There was somewhat of a consistency, even if it had terrible outcomes. They don't have a consistent approach here. It is just to scatter bomb with misinformation and attacks, make people confused and mad. Now, when they do have an agenda, like to get people to take hydroxychloroquine or to not get vaccinated or to take that horse drug, you know it, right? Because there's consistency, but they don't have it here. The only thing that's consistent is Joe Biden is terrible.
Yeah, right. And that's the agenda. As always, before we go, I'd like to get an update on where we are with Fox and the subscriber fees. What's the latest?
Verizon's the next big run in the fall. We're starting up. Now, once Labor Day's over, Fox should kick off their renegotiations with Verizon. I think they're the next big hit. And then at the same time that that's happening, I would just encourage people to know that One American News is working really hard to get themselves picked up on Comcast right now and DirecTV. If they get picked up on Comcast, they will be, if not about the same profitability, more profitable than Bloomberg TV, for context. That's how much revenue Comcast pickup would get. So I think we've got two big fights ahead of us in September. One's going to be making sure that One American News doesn't get Comcast pickup. Comcast has 22% of every single cable customer in this country. 22% of them use Comcast services. 22%, almost one out of every four. That is the big one. And then Fox's cable fight will pick up with Verizon. It's pretty clear that that's going to be their next run. They're not negotiating anything right now, I think, but they will pick up with Verizon. We're going to kick off next month a big push zeroing in on their COVID misinformation as a part of it, some of the other extremism, to sort of start that process all over again, because that's a big one. We need Verizon to hold the line.
Wow. Okay. Keep us posted. Don't forget to follow Angelo on Twitter @GoAngelo to keep up with everything that's going on. And of course, we invite you to follow Media Matters on the internet and also on their website, MediaMatters.org, and also on Twitter as well @MMFA. Angelo Carusone, the president. Angelo, we appreciate you as always, buddy.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Great work. Thank you.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.